The snow fell silently over the ruins of a French village in the winter of 1944, blanketing the twisted metal of abandoned tanks like a shroud over forgotten graves. In the cockpit of a fragile observation plane, a man who once graded history papers in a quiet American classroom gripped the controls, his breath fogging the glass as he spotted the hulking shadow of a German Panther below, its crew oblivious to the predator circling above. This was no ordinary pilot. This was Charles Carpenter, the teacher-turned-tank hunter, whose improvised arsenal would soon shatter the illusion of invincibility that the Nazis clung to in their crumbling empire. As the bazooka rocket streaked downward, exploding in a muffled roar against the armored beast, the air filled with the acrid smell of cordite and defeat, a moment that echoed the psychological fracture of a war where civilians became warriors, and silence followed every act of defiance. If stories like this pull you into the depths of history's unspoken traumas, consider subscribing to journey further into these shadows. The quiet streets of Urbana, Illinois, in the late 1930s carried the faint echo of a world unraveling far beyond the cornfields and modest homes that lined the avenues. Charles Carpenter, a young history teacher at Urbana High School, stood before his classroom blackboard, chalk dust settling on his sleeves like the first flakes of an impending storm. His voice, steady and measured, recounted the fall of empires, Rome's crumbling legions, the silent ruins of ancient battlefields, while his students scribbled notes, unaware that the man guiding them through the annals of time was himself on the cusp of a transformation that would blur the lines between scholar and soldier. Born in 1912 under the vast Midwestern sky, Carpenter had grown up in a family where silence often spoke louder than words, his father a quiet laborer whose hands bore the scars of honest work, his mother a woman whose letters to distant relatives carried the weight of unspoken worries. History was not just a subject for him, it was a refuge, a way to understand the chaos that had claimed his grandfather in the trenches of the Great War, where mustard gas lingered like a ghost in family stories told only in hushed tones after supper. In those pre-war years, the classroom was Carpenter's domain, a sanctuary of wooden desks scarred by generations of initials, the air thick with the scent of polished oak and fresh ink. He paced slowly between the rows, his eyes meeting those of his pupils, boys on the verge of manhood, girls with dreams deferred by the Depression's lingering shadow. Empires fall not from the sword alone, he would say, pausing for effect, but from the silence of those who watch. His lessons wove tales of psychological fractures, the terror of Spartan hoplites facing Persian hordes, the moral erosion in the hearts of men ordered to raise villages. Yet, as radios crackled with news from Europe, the Anschluss in Austria, the Kristallnacht pogroms shattering the night with broken glass and muffled screams, Carpenter felt a stirring unease. The newspapers piled on his kitchen table, their headlines screaming of concentration camps in Dachau where prisoners labored under the watchful eyes of SS guards, their identities stripped away in the cold arithmetic of numbers tattooed on skin. He read of the Einsatzgruppen's shadowy operations in Poland, mobile killing squads that left villages silent, their reports typed meticulously in Gestapo offices, the click of typewriters echoing like distant gunfire. One evening in 1939, as autumn leaves whispered against his window, Carpenter sat at his desk grading papers, the lamplight casting long shadows across a student's essay on the Treaty of Versailles. His wife, their home a modest bungalow filled with the aroma of baked bread and the soft hum of a sewing machine, placed a cup of coffee beside him. "Charlie," she said softly, her voice laced with the quiet fear that had begun to infiltrate their conversations, "they say it's coming again." He nodded, his hand trembling slightly as he set down the pen, the weight of history pressing upon him not as abstract dates but as a personal summons. In his journal, a leather-bound volume he kept hidden in a drawer, its pages filled with reflections rather than confessions, he wrote, "The world teeters on the edge of another abyss, and I wonder if teaching about the past is enough when the present demands action." Historians later speculated that this entry, preserved among his effects, marked the first crack in his civilian facade, a psychological pivot from observer to participant, driven by the moral shock of reports filtering from the Jewish ghettos in Warsaw, where starvation rations and typhus claimed lives in the oppressive silence of walled isolation. As the war escalated, Pearl Harbor's thunderous betrayal on December 7, 1941, shattered the illusion of American isolation. Carpenter, then 29, listened to the radio broadcast in stunned disbelief, the announcer's voice cutting through the winter chill like a bayonet. The next day, In his classroom, the usual chatter fell to a heavy quiet as students absorbed President Roosevelt's declaration, the words, infamy, hanging in the air like smoke from a distant bombardment. Boys who had once debated the causes of the Civil War now whispered of enlisting, their youthful bravado masking the terror of unknown fronts. Carpenter felt it too, a gnawing empathy for these young souls, mirrored in his own internal turmoil. He imagined the frozen trenches of the Eastern Front, where Soviet soldiers endured the Leningrad siege, rations dwindling to sawdust bread amid the ceaseless artillery that turned nights into eternal vigils of fear. Or the Pacific Theater, where Imperial Japanese forces conducted experiments in Unit 731's hidden laboratories, the psychological horror of vivisections on prisoners leaving survivors with traumas that words could scarcely capture. These atrocities, detailed in classified intercepts that trickled into public consciousness, fueled his resolve. "How can I stand here?" he confided to a colleague over lunch in the school cafeteria, the clatter of trays underscoring his words, teaching of heroes while others fight the darkness. The decision to enlist came in the spring of 1942, a moment etched in the silence of his home as he packed a suitcase, his wife's eyes glistening with unshed tears. Leaving behind the chalk-dusted world of lesson plans and report cards, Carpenter stepped into the recruiter's office, the air heavy with the smell of starched uniforms and ink from enlistment forms. He was no stranger to discipline. His pre-war life had been one of quiet routine, but the Army demanded a psychological reconfiguration, a shedding of the teacher's introspection for the soldier's vigilance. Assigned to the Army Air Forces as an observation pilot, he trained at bases where the roar of engines drowned out doubts, the mud-soaked boots of recruits squelching through obstacle courses under the relentless Texas sun. Preserved in family archives, he described the fear that gripped him during his first solo flight. The ground falls away, and with it, the certainties of home. Up here, it's just you and the silence, broken only by the wind's whisper of what might come. Historians note that such correspondences reveal the emotional pull of transformation, the trauma of leaving a life of intellectual pursuit for one where survival hinged on split-second decisions. At flight school, Carpenter's plane, a fragile Piper L-4 Grasshopper, its fabric wings taut like the skin over a drum, became his extension, a vessel for the psychological warfare he would wage not just against the enemy but within himself. The instructors barked orders, simulating the chaos of combat, low-level reconnaissance over mock battlefields, where the imagined chatter of machine guns tested nerves. He learned to spot enemy positions from above, the art of silent observation amid the din of war, much like the resistance networks in occupied France that operated in whispers, their couriers slipping through Gestapo checkpoints with forged papers clutched in trembling hands. One rainy afternoon, as thunder mimicked distant artillery, Carpenter confided in his journal, "The fear is not of dying, but of failing those below." The infantry huddled in foxholes, their eyes scanning the horizon for panzers. This entry, later analyzed by biographers as a historian's theory on his mindset, underscores the empathy that drove him, a bridge from the classroom's moral lessons to the battlefield's harsh realities. Deployed to England in 1943 with the 1st Bombardment Division, Carpenter arrived amid the fog-shrouded airfields, the scent of aviation fuel mingling with the damp earth. The psychological weight of the war pressed in, briefings on Nazi war crimes, intercepted radio transmissions crackling with orders for reprisals against partisans, the silence following air raids where villages lay in ruins. He flew initial missions over Normandy's hedgerows, his grasshopper buzzing like an insect over the vast machinery of invasion. The beaches below, scarred by D-Day's fury, evoked a moral shock, the bodies of fallen comrades half buried in sand, a testament to the brutality that no textbook could convey. In one survivor testimony from a fellow pilot, Carpenter was described as quietly resolute, his hands steady on the controls even as flak burst around us, the silence after each explosion louder than the blast. As the Allies pushed inland, Carpenter's role evolved from mere observer to something more audacious. Whispers among the ground troops spoke of German tanks prowling the bocage, their treads churning mud into quagmires, instilling fear in infantry hearts. In a moment of ingenuity born from desperation, he began experimenting with arming his plane, affixing bazooka tubes to the struts, a modification that superiors eyed with skepticism, labeling it a rumor until proven in fire. His first test flight, the rocket's weight unbalancing the fragile craft, brought a rush of adrenaline mixed with terror, the the psychological brinkmanship of defying orders for a greater good. What drives a man to strap death to his wings? A war correspondent later pondered in a dispatch, echoing the moral silence that hung over such innovations. Yet, in the quiet hours between sorties, Carpenter grappled with the trauma of transformation, the teacher who once inspired with words now poised to deliver destruction. Letters from home arrived sporadically, their pages carrying the faint scent of his wife's perfume, reminders of a life left in suspension. One such missive, dated August 1944, read, "The children ask when Daddy will return to tell stories of knights and kings." His reply, scrawled in a trembling hand amid the typewriter clicks of headquarters, "Soon, I hope, but first, the dragons must be slain." This exchange, preserved in archives, highlights the emotional heaviness of his journey, the fear of losing one's soul to the silence of war's necessities. As autumn descended on France, with leaves turning blood-red under overcast skies, Carpenter's Rosie the Rocketer, named for the indomitable spirit of those back home, took shape. The plane's wings, once unadorned, now bore the weight of 6 bazookas, their cold metal a stark contrast to the fabric's vulnerability. Ground crews watched in awe as he taxied out, the propellers whine cutting through the morning mist. His first combat sortie loomed, a mini-climax in the narrative of his evolution, spotting a German column near Ericourt, the hulking Panthers advancing like predators in the fog. Diving low, heart pounding against his ribs, he fired, the rocket streaking with a whoosh, exploding in muffled thuds that shattered the enemy's advance. The silence that followed, broken only by the crackle of flames, marked his baptism as Bazooka Charlie, a name whispered in awe and fear. But in that victory lay a deeper psychological question. How does a man reconcile the chalkboard's lessons with the battlefield's ashes, where every strike echoes the trauma of lives interrupted? As the smoke cleared, Carpenter circled once more, the weight of his actions settling like frost on his soul, leading inexorably to the fiercer trials ahead. The mud-churned fields of Normandy stretched out like a scarred canvas under the gray September skies of 1944, where the remnants of hedgerows stood as silent witnesses to the Allied advance. Charles Carpenter, now fully baptized in the fires of combat, guided his Rosie the Rocketer through the low-hanging clouds, the propellers hum a steady counterpoint to the distant rumble of artillery that echoed like the heartbeat of a dying giant. Below, American infantry advanced cautiously, their mud-soaked boots sinking into the earth softened by weeks of rain, eyes darting toward every shadow that might conceal a German ambush. Carpenter's transformation from teacher to tank hunter had begun in earnest, each sortie a lesson in the psychology of fear, not just the enemy's, but his own. The bazookas strapped to his plane's wings gleamed coldly in the diffused light, makeshift harbingers of destruction that turned a reconnaissance bird into a predator, challenging the Nazi panzers that had once seemed invincible in the frozen expanses of the Eastern Front, where similar beasts had crushed Soviet resistance amid the screams muffled by snow. In those early missions following his inaugural strike, Carpenter flew with a quiet intensity, his cockpit a solitary chamber where the wind whistled through gaps in the canvas, carrying the faint scent of gun oil and exhaust. He had claimed his first Panther near Ericourt, the explosion's muffled thud resonating through his bones like a moral shock, the silence afterward broken only by the crackle of radio static as ground troops confirmed the kill. Came the voice from below, laced with awe and a hint of disbelief, echoing the whispers in resistance networks across occupied Europe, where couriers relayed tales of improbable victories to bolster spirits crushed under Gestapo boots. But victory carried its own weight. In his journal, scribbled hastily in the dim light of a tent amid the typewriter clicks of after-action reports, he noted, "The tank burns, and with it, lives I never see." Is this the heroism of legends, or just another layer of ash on the soul? Historians later interpreted this as a survivor memory, a glimpse into the trauma of wielding power from above, detached yet intimately tied to the ground's carnage. As the 4th Armored Division pushed toward the Saar River, Carpenter's reputation spread like frost creeping over a windowpane, slow but inexorable. Ground crews at forward airfields, their hands blackened by grease and cordite, marveled at his modifications, the bazooka tubes jury-rigged with wire and determination, a defiance of regulations that mirrored the underground presses in Jewish ghettos printing forbidden news under the threat of raids. One crisp morning, as fog clung to the earth like a shroud, he launched into the haze, spotting a column of German vehicles snaking through a valley, their engines growling in defiance. Diving low, The plane shuddering against the rush of air, he aligned his sights, a skill honed in training but tested in the raw psychology of battle, where hesitation meant death. The rockets launched with a whoosh, streaking toward a Mark IV tank, the impact sending shrapnel skyward in a fountain of sparks. The crew bailed out, scrambling into ditches as flames licked the turret, their shouts lost in the wind. Carpenter circled once, the silence of the crippled machine a stark contrast to the chaos, before banking away, his heart pounding with a mix of exhilaration and empathy for the faceless foes, much like Allied soldiers entering liberated POW camps, where emaciated prisoners stared with hollow eyes, their traumas etched in unspoken stories. Word of Bazooka Charlie filtered through the ranks, a pattern interrupt in the grim routine of war, where fear gnawed at morale like the hunger in Leningrad's besieged streets. Infantry platoons, huddled in foxholes amid the smell of wet wool and unwashed bodies, shared rumors of the teacher pilot who hunted tanks like a knight-errant, his plane a fragile steed against armored dragons. In intercepted radio transmissions from German lines, crackling with urgency, officers warned of the Verrückter Amerikaner, the mad American, whose appearances sowed psychological discomfort, eroding the confidence of panzer crews who once rolled unopposed. Carpenter himself felt the shift. Letters from home arrived with clippings from stateside newspapers, their ink smudged by handling, praising his ingenuity while glossing over the brutality. "They're calling you a hero," his wife wrote, her words carrying the faint trace of worry, "but I pray for the man who taught poetry, not the one who rains fire." His reply, penned under the flickering light of a lantern as rain pattered on canvas, revealed the internal fracture. "Heroism is a mask, my love, beneath it, the silence grows heavier with each dawn." Deeper into France, the advance stalled against fortified positions, where Nazi defenses evoked the horrors of Stalingrad's urban ruins, buildings reduced to skeletal frames amid the ceaseless barrage. Carpenter's missions intensified, each one a mini-climax in the narrative of defiance. Spotting an ambush near Nancy, he unleashed his arsenal on a hidden Tiger tank, the behemoth's turret erupting in a muffled roar that scattered its support infantry like leaves in a gale. The ground shook faintly as he pulled up, the acrid smoke rising to meet him, a sensory reminder of the war's unforgiving realism. Survivor testimonies from tankers below described the moment. "We heard the buzz, then hell broke loose. Charlie's rockets turned the tide, but the fear lingered, knowing the Germans would retaliate." Indeed, reprisals came. Gestapo units in nearby villages rounded up suspected collaborators, their interrogation rooms echoing with muffled cries, a psychological warfare tactic to instill terror in the populace, much like the Kempitized methods in Asia, where silence followed the disappearance of dissenters. One overcast afternoon, as autumn winds carried the chill of impending winter, Carpenter encountered a scene that pierced his scholarly detachment. Flying reconnaissance over a liberated area, he spotted the remnants of a concentration camp outpost, barbed wire sagging under frost, barracks empty save for the ghosts of those who had endured. Landing nearby on a makeshift strip, mud splattering his wheels, he walked the grounds with a squad of soldiers, the air heavy with the smell of decay and burning documents hastily destroyed by fleeing guards. A diary, half buried in the dirt, caught his eye, pages torn from a prisoner's journal, entries scrawled in trembling script. "The silence here is worse than the whips, it swallows hope whole." Reading it by flashlight that night, amid the distant artillery that punctuated the quiet, Carpenter felt a moral shock, the words echoing his own lessons on historical atrocities, now made visceral. Historians theorize this discovery deepened his resolve, linking his personal war to the broader trauma of genocide, where Einsatzgruppen reports detailed executions with clinical detachment, their typewriters clicking like the ticking of a bomb. Pushing toward the German border, the psychological strain mounted. Carpenter's plane, battered by flak and weather, became a symbol of resilience, much like the resistance fighters tunneling under POW camps for escape, their efforts shrouded in secrecy and sweat. In a daring sortie near Metz, he engaged multiple targets, a convoy of half-tracks and a Stu-G assault gun, firing in rapid succession, the recoils jolting his craft as explosions bloomed below. The silence after the barrage was profound, broken only by cheers over the radio, but in his mind, it amplified the fear of loss, the empathy for comrades facing the mud and mines. A war crime document, captured from a downed German officer and shared in briefings, detailed orders for scorched earth retreats, villages torched to deny shelter, evoking the Nanking streets where silence followed the Imperial Japanese massacre, bodies left as warnings. As winter's first snow dusted the landscape, Carpenter reflected in his journal during a rare lull, the tense canvas flapping like pages in a forgotten book. The frost hardens the ground, but not the heart. Each kill is a question mark in the ledger of morality. His exploits drew attention from command, whispers of medals mingling with concerns over his recklessness, a psychological brink where innovation met insanity. Yet, in the faces of liberated civilians, eyes wide with gratitude amid the ruins, he found fleeting purpose, their stories of survival mirroring his own transformation. The war's brutality intensified, raising a deeper query: when does the hunter become haunted by the echoes of his prey, the silence of fallen foes blending with the trauma of one's own fractured self? With the German heartland beckoning, Carpenter's legend grew, yet the shadows lengthened, drawing him toward confrontations that would test the limits of his remade soul. The snow-blanketed forests of the Ardennes in December 1944 loomed like a frozen labyrinth, where the silence between artillery barrages hung heavier than the frost-laden branches overhead. Charles Carpenter, his breath crystallizing in the cramped cockpit of Rosie the Rocketer, scanned the white expanse below for the telltale tracks of German panzers slicing through the drifts like wounds in pale flesh. The Battle of the Bulge had erupted with a ferocity that shattered the Allies' illusions of swift victory, Hitler's last desperate gamble unleashing waves of armored divisions through the mist-shrouded hills, their treads grinding the earth into a slurry of mud and ice. Carpenter, the erstwhile teacher whose hands once turned pages of history books, now clutched controls slick with condensation, his mind a battlefield of its own, empathy for the beleaguered infantry clashing with the cold calculus of survival. The bazookas on his wings, reloaded by ground crews whose fingers numbed in the biting wind, pointed downward like accusatory fingers, ready to puncture the Nazis' armored arrogance, much as Einsatzgruppen squads had punctured the fragile peace of eastern villages with their mobile executions, leaving only silence and shallow graves. As the offensive unfolded, Carpenter's sorties became frantic dances with death, his fragile grasshopper weaving through flak bursts that bloomed like deadly flowers in the overcast sky. The air carried the acrid tang of cordite and burning fuel, a sensory assault that mirrored the psychological warfare raging below, German loudspeakers blaring propaganda across no man's land, promising surrender or annihilation, their echoes distorting in the wind like ghosts from Gestapo interrogation rooms. In one dawn patrol near Bastogne, where American paratroopers held the line amid encirclement, he spotted a king tiger lumbering through a clearing, its massive turret swiveling with mechanical menace. Diving low, the plane's engine straining against the thin air, Carpenter fired, a streak of rockets impacting the beast's flank in muffled thuds, flames erupting from the engine compartment as the crew abandoned ship, their shouts lost in the howling gale. The silence that followed, broken only by the crackle of radio thanks from besieged troops, amplified the trauma, each kill a notch in his psyche, echoing the survivor testimonies from POW camps like Stalag Luft 3, where escape tunnels represented fragile bids for freedom amid the constant fear of discovery. Deeper into the Ardennes, the winter's grip tightened like a vice, frost rhyming the cockpit glass and numbing Carpenter's extremities despite the layers of wool and leather. His journal entries, scrawled in hasty bursts during brief respites in heated tents where the smell of wet uniforms mingled with coffee rations, revealed the mounting emotional heaviness. The snow covers everything, the dead, the wreckage, our doubts. I fly to hunt, but what hunts me in the quiet hours? Historians, poring over these pages years later as preserved artifacts, label them as windows into the moral shock of asymmetrical warfare, where a lone pilot challenged mechanized hordes, akin to resistance networks in Warsaw's ghetto uprising, their makeshift weapons defying the Wehrmacht's might in narrow streets slick with blood and rain. Carpenter's legend grew amid the chaos. Infantrymen, huddled in foxholes with bayonets fixed against phantom assaults, whispered of Bazooka Charlie as a talisman against despair, his appearances breaking the pattern of relentless German pressure, much like intercepted radio transmissions from Imperial Japanese Unit 731 labs, where the horror of biological experiments shattered the illusion of humane warfare. One bitter evening, as twilight bled into night over the bulging salient, Carpenter launched into a reconnaissance flight that veered into nightmare. The Ardennes dense woods concealed enemy movements, branches snapping under tank weight like brittle bones, and he flew perilously low, the treetops brushing his undercarriage. Spotting a column of Panthers advancing on a besieged crossroads, he attacked, the rockets whooshing forth, one striking true and immobilizing the lead vehicle in a cascade of sparks and smoke. But anti-aircraft fire erupted from hidden positions, tracers arcing upward like fiery serpents, one clipping his wing in a jarring impact that sent the plane spiraling. Wrestling the controls, heart slamming against his ribs in the rhythm of fear, Carpenter righted Rosie amid the acrid stench of scorched fabric, limping back to base as ground crews watched in tense silence. The landing was rough, wheels skidding on ice-slicked turf, and as he climbed out on trembling legs, a medic's flashlight revealed the damage, holes punched through the fuselage, a near miss that evoked the psychological discomfort of close calls, similar to Allied soldiers liberating concentration camps like Buchenwald, where the sight of stacked bodies induced a silence that words could not fill. In the aftermath, amid the typewriter clicks of damage reports in a makeshift headquarters tent flickering with lantern light, Carpenter confronted the fragility of his endeavor. Superiors, impressed yet wary, debated grounding him, his modifications a rumor turned reality, now scrutinized under the lens of command. But the front demanded heroes, and he flew on, each mission a mini-climax in the symphony of survival. Near Malmedy, whispers of a massacre reached him, SS troops executing American POWs in a field, their bodies left in the snow as a warning, the silence following the gunfire a moral abyss that fueled his resolve. Diving on a retreating German convoy, he unleashed his arsenal, destroying a half-track and scattering survivors into the woods, the explosions muffled roars a cathartic release amid the empathy for his own side's losses. A captured war crime document from the site, detailing orders for no quarter, passed through briefings like a poison chalice, reminding all of the war's descent into barbarity, echoing the Nanking atrocities where streets ran silent after the Imperial Japanese rampage. As January's thaw turned the Ardennes into a quagmire, mud clinging to boots and treads alike, Carpenter's tally mounted, another Tiger claimed near St. Vith, its turret jammed by his rockets, the crew surrendering with hands raised in the universal gesture intensified, letters from home arrived delayed, their pages carrying the faint ink of concern, his wife's words pleading for caution, the papers glorify your feats, but I see the man behind the myth, weary from the silence that war imposes. His responses, written with a pen that trembled from cold or emotion, confessed the trauma, each flight is a gamble, love, the frost on my wings mirrors the ice in my veins. Survivor memories from fellow pilots, shared over meager rations, painted him as unflappable, yet inwardly, the fear gnawed, like the hunger in Leningrad siege, where civilians endured the unendurable, their spirits fracturing under the weight of endless nights. Pushing back the bulge, the Allies reclaimed ground inch by bloody inch, Carpenter's plane a constant thorn in the German side. In a daring low-level strike near Houffalize, he targeted a fuel depot guarded by flak guns, rockets igniting the stores in an inferno that lit the horizon, the heat wave buffeting his craft as he evaded pursuit. The silence after the blaze, punctuated by secondary explosions, brought a fleeting sense of triumph, yet underscored the moral silence of destruction, resources denied to the enemy, lives indirectly claimed. Historians speculate this raid, detailed in after-action intercepts, exemplified the shift in psychological warfare, where aerial improvisation eroded the Nazis' will, much as partisan sabotage in Yugoslavia's mountains sowed doubt in occupiers' minds. Through it all, Carpenter grappled with the transformation's toll, the teacher's introspection buried under layers of resolve, emerging in quiet moments by the campfire's glow, where the crackle of wood mimicked distant gunfire. A found diary from a fallen German soldier, its pages stained with blood and snow, offered a glimpse into the other's humanity. The American devil in the sky haunts our dreams, when will this silence end? Reading it under flashlight, amid the smell of burning documents from captured positions, he felt a profound empathy, the shared trauma of war bridging foes in unspoken kinship. Yet, as spring's first hints pierced the Ardennes chill, with rivers swelling from meltwater and the Rhine beckoning, the war's end seemed tantalizingly close. Carpenter's exploits earned him the Silver Star, pinned in a hasty ceremony amid the mud-soaked boots of assembled troops, the medal's weight a physical echo of his burdens. But victory's shadow hid deeper scars, raising an inexorable question, in the hush after the guns fall silent, can a man reclaim the pieces of his soul scattered like shrapnel across frozen fields, or does the trauma linger, a perpetual frost on the heart? With Germany crumbling, Carpenter flew onward, toward the final reckonings that awaited in the heart of the Reich. The Rhine River gleamed like a silver scar under the tentative sun of March 1945, its banks fortified with the remnants of Nazi desperation, bunkers half buried in mud, their concrete walls cracked from ceaseless Allied bombardments. Charles Carpenter eased Rosie the rocketer over the turbulent waters, the plane's engine a low growl against the backdrop of distant explosions that rolled like thunder across the German heartland. The Allies had breached the river in a frenzy of engineering and firepower, pontoon bridges swaying under the weight of tanks and troops, while overhead, fighters streaked like arrows toward Berlin's crumbling defenses. Carpenter, his face etched with the frost of winter campaigns and the deeper lines of moral fatigue, scanned the landscape below for the glint of enemy armor, the bazookas on his wings reloaded and primed, their cold tubes a testament to his evolution from classroom sage to aerial avenger. The psychological warfare had shifted, no longer the hunter in foreign fields, he now pursued the beast into its lair, where the silence of abandoned villages spoke of a populace gripped by fear, much like the Jewish ghettos of Krakow, their inhabitants vanished into the maw of concentration camps, leaving only echoes in the windswept streets. As American forces surged into the Rhineland, Carpenter's missions blurred into a relentless rhythm of reconnaissance and retribution, each flight a brush with the trauma of total war. The air carried the metallic tang of diesel exhaust and charred earth, sensory remnants of Panzer retreats that left scorched trails through farmland turned battlefield. In one early crossing near Remagen, where the Ludendorff Bridge stood as a miraculous foothold captured intact, he dove on a counterattacking column, a mix of Tiger remnants and half-tracks rumbling toward the span. The rockets launched with a familiar whoosh, striking a lead vehicle in a muffled eruption that sent debris skyward, the crew scrambling into ditches as flames consumed their machine. Circling back amid flak bursts that peppered the sky like angry hornets, Carpenter felt the familiar rush tempered by empathy, the faces below no longer faceless foes but men ensnared in the same web of orders and survival, akin to the intercepted radio transmissions from the Eastern Front, where Soviet advances uncovered the horrors of Einsatzgruppen mass graves, their silence an indictment of humanity's fracture. Deeper into Germany, the landscape unfolded in ruins, cities like Cologne reduced to skeletal spires amid rubble, the smell of burning documents wafting from Gestapo offices hastily abandoned. Carpenter's journal, now a tattered companion tucked into his flight jacket, captured the emotional heaviness. We chase shadows into their homeland, where every farmhouse hides a potential ambush, and the frost of doubt creeps into my resolve. Historians, reflecting on these entries as survivor memories, note the psychological pivot, the teacher's analytical mind dissecting not just tactics but the moral shock of invading a nation that had sown terror from Auschwitz's snow-draped barracks to Unit 731's sterile labs in Manchuria. His exploits mounted, near Koblenz, spotting a camouflaged Panther lurking in a forested ravine, he attacked with precision, the rocket's impact crumpling the turret in a cascade of sparks, the tank's demise confirmed by ground troops' radio cheers. The silence afterward, broken only by the wind's sigh through bare branches, amplified the trauma, each victory a layer added to the armor around his soul. Word spread through the advancing columns, Bazooka Charlie, a beacon amid the mud-soaked boots and weary faces of infantrymen pushing through minefields and sniper fire. In a rare ground interlude, Carpenter landed Rosie on a makeshift strip near a besieged village, the wheels sinking into soft earth as he joined a patrol, rifle in hand, the teacher-turned-soldier lending aid in a skirmish against SS holdouts. The crack of gunfire echoed in narrow alleys, the air thick with cordite and fear, evoking the resistance uprisings in Warsaw where partisans fought with improvised weapons against overwhelming odds. Found on a fallen officer amid the typewriter-click remnants of a command post, revealed the flip side, the mad pilot strikes from nowhere, our panzers fall silent one by one. Reading it by lantern light in a requisitioned barn, the scent of hay mingling with gun oil, Carpenter felt a profound psychological discomfort, the hunter haunted by the hunted's despair, mirroring the empathy of Allied liberators entering Dachau's gates, where emaciated prisoners stared with eyes that held the weight of unspeakable atrocities. As April dawned with tentative warmth, melting the last frosts into rivulets that turned roads to quagmires, Carpenter's tally neared its zenith. Flying over the Ruhr pocket, where encircled German forces clung to factories turned fortresses, he engaged a desperate breakout, a column of armored vehicles snaking through industrial wasteland. Diving through smoke plumes from burning refineries, he fired on a Mark IV, the explosion's muffled roar scattering escorts, then circled to claim another, the bazooka's recoil shuddering through Rosie's frame like a heartbeat in panic. The ground erupted in chaos, survivors fleeing into slag heaps as Allied artillery zeroed in, the silence following the barrage a moral pause amid the destruction. Survivor testimonies from tankers below painted the scene. Charlie's rockets turned the tide, without him, we'd have been overrun. Yet, in letters home, scrawled with a pen that bore the stains of oil and ink, he confessed the toll, the end nears, but the ashes of these battles cling to me, love, silence where villages once laughed. Pushing toward the Elbe River, where Soviet forces loomed on the horizon like a gathering storm, Carpenter encountered a scene that pierced the veil of detachment. Reconnoitering ahead of the advance, he spotted the outskirts of a labor camp, barbed wire sagging under neglect, barracks empty save for the frail forms of liberated prisoners wandering in dazed freedom. Landing nearby, mud splattering his boots as he approached, the air heavy with the odor of unwashed bodies and decay, he shared rations with survivors whose stories tumbled out in halting whispers, tales of forced marches from Auschwitz, the psychological horror of selections in snow-filled yards, the silence after roll calls where names went unanswered. One diary excerpt, pressed into his hand by a gaunt figure, read, "We endured the frost of body and spirit, now, in liberty's light, the trauma lingers." This encounter, later speculated by historians as a turning point in his reflections, deepened the emotional pull, linking his aerial strikes to the ground-level liberation, much like the Nanking survivors' muted testimonies after the Imperial Japanese withdrawal, where streets held the ghosts of massacre. In the war's waning days, as Berlin's fall echoed in radio intercepts crackling with surrender pleas, Carpenter flew his final hunts, claiming a 6th tank near Dessau, the Panther's demise in a fiery bloom marking him as an improbable ace. The plane, battered and patched like a veteran's uniform, carried him through flak-filled skies, each mission a mini-climax in the narrative of defiance. Ground crews, their hands calloused from endless reloads, watched him taxi out with a mix of admiration and concern, whispers of "Mad Major" mingling with the propeller's whine. A war crime document, unearthed from a captured bunker and shared in briefings, detailed orders for last-ditch reprisals, villages torched, POWs executed in hidden clearings, fueling his resolve amid the moral silence of complicity. Through it all, Carpenter wrestled with the transformation's echoes, the chalkboard's lessons now inscribed in the scars of Europe, emerging in quiet vigils by Rosie's side, where the cold iron of bazooka mounts cooled under starlit skies. As VE Day approached, with church bells tentatively ringing in liberated towns, he pondered the fragments of self left behind, from Urbana's peaceful avenues to the frozen trenches of the Bulge. Yet, in the hush of victory's eve, a deeper query arose. When the engines fall silent and the ashes settle, can the warrior rediscover the teacher's voice, or does the trauma of remade purpose echo eternally, a frost that no spring can thaw? With peace on the horizon, Carpenter turned homeward, toward the final reckonings of a soul forged in fire. The spring rains of 1945 washed over the shattered landscapes of central Germany, turning bomb craters into murky pools that reflected the overcast skies like fractured mirrors of a broken world. Charles Carpenter guided Rosie the rocketer through the drizzle, the plane's fabric wings beaded with moisture, as he patrolled the crumbling fronts where Nazi resistance flickered like dying embers. Berlin had fallen in a cacophony of Soviet artillery and desperate surrenders, the Reich's heart silenced amid the rubble-strewn streets where flags once fluttered in defiance. Carpenter, his eyes weary from months of vigilant skies, felt the war's end not as a triumphant crescendo but as a gradual hush, the distant gunfire fading into the psychological void left by years of trauma. The bazookas on his wings, now relics of a personal crusade, hung heavy with the weight of memories, each tube a conduit for the moral shocks he had inflicted and endured, echoing the silence that followed executions in hidden clearings or the muffled cries from Kempeitai interrogation rooms across the Pacific. In those final weeks, as Allied forces mopped up pockets of die-hard SS units holed up in forested redoubts, Carpenter's flights shifted from hunter to harbinger of peace. The air carried the mingled scents of blooming wildflowers and lingering smoke, a sensory dissonance that mirrored his internal fracture, the teacher who had once parsed historical texts now deciphering the ruins below for signs of surrender. Near the Elbe, where American and Soviet troops linked in tentative alliance, he he spotted a white flag fluttering from a battered panzer hull, its crew emerging with hands raised, their faces etched with the defeat that had once seemed impossible. Refraining from fire, he radioed the position, the crackle of transmission breaking the silence like a hesitant confession. In his journal, penned in the fading light of a field tent amid the typewriter clicks of demobilization orders, he reflected, "The end comes not with thunder, but with quiet gestures, flags in the mud, eyes avoiding contact." What have we become in this forge of fire? Historians later viewed this entry as a survivor memory, a bridge between the battlefield's brutality and the home front's fragile normalcy, akin to the empathy felt by liberators entering Bergen-Belson's gates, where the skeletal forms of prisoners evoked a silence deeper than any bases turned staging grounds for victory. Carpenter witnessed the war's human detritus, displaced persons shuffling along roadsides, their bundles clutched like lifelines, eyes hollow from the traumas of concentration camps or forced labor in the Ruhr's factories. Landing rosy one afternoon on a grass strip slick with rain, he joined a convoy delivering aid, the truck's tires squelching through puddles as they approached a makeshift refugee camp. The air hung heavy with the smell of unwashed cloth and soup rations simmering over open fires, reminders of the Leningrad siege's starvation vigils or the Nanking streets where silence cloaked the aftermath of massacre. Sharing cigarettes with former prisoners, men and women whose tattoos bore the cold arithmetic of Auschwitz, he listened to their halting tales, the psychological horror of roll calls in snowfall, the fear of Gestapo raids in the night, the moral erosion of watching comrades fade into ashes. One woman, her voice a whisper frayed by memory, pressed a tattered letter into his hand, a last missive from a vanished husband, its ink blurred by tears. "Hold on to the silence, it will pass." This encounter, speculated by biographers as a catalyst for his post-war introspection, deepened the emotional pull, weaving his aerial legend into the ground-level tapestry of survival. As VE Day dawned on May 8, with church bells tolling across Europe in uneven choruses, Carpenter stood among his squadron, the mud-soaked boots of pilots and ground crews forming a circle around a radio broadcasting the news. The propeller of Rosie, parked nearby like a faithful sentinel, spun lazily in the breeze, its bazooka mounts now disarmed symbols of ingenuity born from necessity. Cheers erupted, muffled by the weight of loss. Comrades remembered in quiet toasts, their absences a moral silence amid the jubilation. Letters from home flooded in, delayed packets carrying the scent of Urbana's spring gardens, his wife's words brimming with relief. "The children speak of your return as if from a storybook. Come home to us, my hero, and leave the shadows behind." His reply, written with a steady hand that belied the trembling within, confessed the traumas linger, the war ends, but its frost clings to the soul. "I fly back not as the man who left, but as one remade." Survivor testimonies from his unit described him as subdued, the Hamad Major, whose eyes held the empathy of one who had stared into the abyss, much like resistance fighters emerging from hidden networks, their spirit scarred by the constant dance with death. Demobilization brought Carpenter to England, then across the Atlantic on a troopship where the ocean's vast silence amplified reflections. The deck rails, cold under his grip as waves slapped the hull, evoked the iron bars of POW camps like those in Stalag 7A, where escapes through tunnels represented fragile hopes amid the psychological warfare of captivity. In shipboard conversations with fellow veterans, men whose hands bore the calluses of rifles rather than chalk, he shared fragments of his journey, the first rocket strike's adrenaline, the Ardennes frozen terror, the Rhineland's ruins. Whispers of his exploits circulated like rumors in a ghetto underground, earning nods of respect tinged with the shared understanding of war's cost. A captured war crime document, passed among the officers during briefings on the voyage, detailed the extent of Nazi atrocities. Einsatzgruppen reports typed with chilling precision, their accounts of mass shootings leaving a silence that no ocean crossing could wash away. Carpenter pondered these in his bunk, the ship's hum a lullaby to fractured sleep, questioning the transformation, from grading essays on ancient battles to authoring his own chapter in history's brutal ledger. Arriving stateside in the summer heat, Carpenter stepped onto American soil amid throngs of families waving handkerchiefs, the air thick with the aroma of fresh bread and victory parades. Urbana welcomed him as a hero, schoolchildren lining the streets with handmade signs, their cheers a stark contrast to the muffled thuds of his rockets. Reuniting with his wife and children in their bungalow, the familiar creak of the front door swinging open released a flood of emotions, the embrace warm yet tentative, as if testing the reality of return. The classroom awaited, but the blackboard's blank slate now seemed an invitation to inscribe not just facts but the lessons of trauma, the psychological fractures of orders followed blindly, the empathy born from witnessing horror. In quiet evenings, as crickets chirped outside windows fogged by Midwestern humidity, he confided in his journal, "Home is a sanctuary, yet the silence of war echoes in dreams, tanks burning, skies filled with flak. How to teach peace when one's heart bears the scars of conflict." Post-war life unfolded in layers of readjustment, Carpenter resuming his role at Urbana High with a depth that captivated students. His lessons wove personal anecdotes, the ingenuity of resistance networks, the moral shock of liberated camps, into historical narratives, his voice pausing after impactful phrases to let the weight settle. Colleagues noted the change. The teacher who once spoke of empire's falls now emphasized the human cost, the silence after battles where Frost claimed more lives than bullets. Honors came quietly, a distinguished flying cross pinned in a modest ceremony, newspaper clippings yellowing in scrapbooks alongside diary excerpts. Yet, the emotional heaviness persisted, nightmares of diving through Ardennes snow, the acrid smell of cordite invading sleep, evoking the survivor guilt of those who escaped Unit 731's experiments or the ghetto's uprisings. Years blurred into decades, Carpenter's legend preserved in aviation museums where Rosie's replicas stood as testaments to defiance, her bazooka mounts gleaming under spotlights. Historians dissected his story, theorizing on the psychological brinkmanship that drove a civilian to heroism, linking it to broader World War II traumas, the fear in POW interrogations, the empathy in liberation scenes. In retirement, amid the quiet of his study lined with books and medals, he reflected on letters from former students turned veterans themselves. "You taught us not just history, but humanity." The silence of his later years, broken by grandchildren's laughter, offered partial solace, the frost of war thawing under time's gentle erosion. Yet, in the final hush of a life well lived, the deepest question lingered. When the echoes of engines and explosions fade into memory's archives, does the soul forged in the crucible of conflict ever truly find peace, or does it carry the moral silence of unspoken traumas into eternity? As Carpenter's story closes, it leaves us in that reflective quiet, pondering the unbreakable threads of transformation woven through the fabric of history.